You ever heard the story of the hillbilly farmer? Hillbilly farmer. You know, of course, that the hillbillies, they live in the Smoky Mountains up there in Virginia. I remember passing through that area one time when the bus broke down and we were stranded for an hour, but the hillbillies didn't come to help us. But anyway, that's where they dwell, of course. And they're well-known people. In fact, they're actually most likely came from Northern Ireland originally and went out there and dwelt. When you think of it, the hillbillies were famous for their making, what was the stuff that they made? Moonshine, yeah. That was their liquor. And what do you think the people here made before they went out to, they made the potshie. So it's the same thing. In fact, we still talk about being the Billy Boys over here. That's one of the songs, we are the Billy Boys. So it's probably the same people, only they moved out there. And they lived up on the mountains and very good people, but they usually didn't see a lot of activity. But the story is of one hillbilly farmer, and he got into his wagon and he down the mountain. And it was the first time really that he had been in the big city. So he got into the big city, there was all this activity. But what he was looking for was a lawyer. He's up and down the street and he sees a sign, lawyer. So he goes in and the lawyer says to him, "Well, good morning, sir, nice to see you. What can I do for you? How can I help you?" And he said, "Well, sir," I want one of those divorces. I want one of those divorces. And the lawyer said, "Well, you want a divorce? Do you have grounds for it?" He said, "Oh yes," he says, "I have 140 acres. So he was a little bit on the slow side. And then the lawyer says, "I think maybe you're looking for a lawsuit." He says, "No, I've got a suit, sir." He wore it at my wedding, and he says, "I only wear it now for funerals." So the lawyer said, "Tell me something, does your wife ever beat you up?" "No, sir," he says, "we both get up at the same time every morning." So the poor lawyer, he started to wonder what's going on. And then he said, "Well, the final question I have to ask you, sir," he says, "why do you want a divorce?" So he looked at the lawyer and he says, "Well, it's like this, sir," he says, "I just can't have an intelligent conversation with my wife." Communication, of course, when you think about it causes a problem. Communication. Sometimes people don't talk enough to each other, and people say, "Oh, well, we never really talk." Communication can be a big problem. But this morning I would like to look at the other side of communication, and that is of listening. Listening to other people, because that's probably even more important than the talking. It's a very important subject, believe me. We'll go away this morning. And I want to bring out the importance of it. And it's good for us, I do believe, to be reminded of this from time to time, because it's something that we can so easily take for granted. I remember reading a book, in fact I've still got it, How to Remember Everything. I was one of those people who always wanted to be able to remember everything. I forgot to bring it with me, by the way, but I'm only good. There's it there, How to Remember Everything by Mark Shannon. And in that book, one of the points he brings out is, teach yourself to be an effective listener. And if you can train yourself to be a really good listener, okay, then that will help you to have a really good memory. So you can all run down Nations and get the book. You might say, don't people talk more than they listen? That's what I used to think, of course, but that's not true. Let's face it, on an average day, most of us sleep about 8 hours, which is a third of a day. But what do we do with the other 2/3? Well, I'll tell you what it says. 10% is spent writing, 15% is spent reading, and 30% is spent talking. Ladies, some wee bit more than that, but we'll let it off that. But 45% of your waking time is spent listening. Hard to believe. And people can talk or speak 150 words per minute, but we can hear 450 words per minute. That's why God has given us 2 years and only one tongue. So the point is, we've got to develop this ability to listen more. I think we're all fairly good at it, but it's something that we just have to perhaps keep in mind. Now, I have here a list. It's from a university in the United States, and it gives it advice on listening. So let me quickly read that. It says, effective listening is one of the most important skills to have nowadays. Personal relationships need effective listening. Personal relationships need effective listening skills to face the complicated issues of this life today. Business people and employees need effective listening skills to solve complex problems quickly and stay competitive. Students like Rachel, professional people like Mr. Roycroft, needed to understand complex issues in their fields and in the ministry. It's important that you really hear. It says that is beneficial if you can understand and eliminate barriers, because apparently there are barriers which prevent us from really listening and hearing what people are saying. We're not conscious of those barriers, but they do exist. For most people, it says, we listen only to answer back. That's true. Someone's speaking to us, but we're really listening to see what we can say back. To have a reply instead of listening to what they're saying so we can understand. Effective listening is not just about hearing the words that people say, but really getting to hear the depth of what they're saying and why they're saying it. And I think those points are all very, very true. Now, thinking about it, we all know, of course, this morning that not listening has been one of the biggest problems facing mankind since the very beginning. Well, you might say, Morris, it's not really that, is it? Because it's not as if everybody's been deaf, couldn't hear what was being said, especially from God. But is the problem not that they weren't obeying? That they weren't obeying? Well, the truth of that is, that is true. That's very true. Let's see if I can find the notes this morning, but the Hebrew word for listening is actually, it's just not hearing a sound or a word. It means to really grasp what is being said. In a sense, it's obedience. It's a deeper than just hearing. So that's what we really are talking about. It's not as if people can't hear. They hear okay, but they don't really take on board what God has been saying to them. The Hebrew word actually for listening is shama. As it says, shama. It means to hear intelligently, to consider. In a sense, it's an obedience, and to discern what God is saying. So what it's saying is to listen, not only with your ears, but listen with your heart and with your mind. Taking in and assimilating what God is saying to you, and then using it as He directs. Now, let's consider for a moment that man hasn't really listened to God. Let's start with Adam and Eve. And we know that they didn't really listen. Alright? They didn't listen to God, but they listened to Satan. Because of that, the world was cursed. Think of the problems that resulted just because they didn't take heed of what God was saying. many years later, then Noah, the world at that time was in a disaster situation. And God used this powerful man, a minister of righteousness, it said, who maybe spent 100 years speaking and crying out to the people. And yet, we know only a handful of them listened. Only a handful. And again, disaster situation, and we know what happened at that time. Now you might think, what about God's chosen people, Israel? Surely they would have listened. Maybe sometimes. And for one thing for certain, they said they would. Oh God, we have heard you, we will listen. But we know, of course, that they didn't. They said they would, but they didn't. The oldest prayer known is called the Shema. It's a Shema. You find it over actually in Deuteronomy chapter 6, so we could maybe turn there, please. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 3. This is where they get this prayer from. It's amazing scripture. God says, here. He repeats it actually. He usually says it twice, so you get the point. Here. Therefore, Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with you, and that you may increase mightily, as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, in the land that flows with milk and honey. What a promise, what a blessing the people were going to get. Verse 4, Hear again, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Very clear instructions. Very clear indeed. In actual fact, the Jews made a point of making that the most important prayer. Before they did anything in the morning, they said that prayer. Before they would go to bed at night, they would quote that prayer. It was in their hearts, in a sense. They actually got it printed on parchment, and they rolled it up like you do a cigarette. A little roll, and they put it in a little case called a mezuzah, and they hung that on the doorpost. As always, to remind them what God had said. They even made a tiny hole in the top of the packet. And if you could look in, you would see the word for God. They were meticulous how they did things, that you really were. Yet in spite of all of that, they didn't listen. Amazing. As I say, Israel promised God, but they didn't. And what was the result? Of course, amazing. Instead, they, as a nation, started to fight among each other, and the whole nation of Israel was divided. One, Judah, and the tribes of Israel. They couldn't even live in peace together. Israel, we know, eventually went into captivity. Went into captivity in Assyria. Now you can read that, of course, but if you could really get your minds around the situation that the people faced, the pain, the suffering, the hurt, the anguish, disappointment, the things that took place were deplorable. And that's what happened to them because they did not listen to God. Now, Judah on the other side, you would have think, boy, we better learn a lesson. Because there was a living example of what happens if they didn't listen to God. Did they take heed? Did they listen? Sadly, no. Not only did Judah lose the plot, as I would say, but they actually, would you believe, lost the book. They lost the book. How could they lose the book? How could they lose the Bible? How could they lose the Scriptures? Well, they did. For hundreds of years, they didn't have it. In actual fact, if you read the history of the kings of Judah, it was in King Josiah's time that they're working in the vaults of the temple. And one of the guys happened to find this thing and say, "What's that?" Get the dust off that. "What's that?" And they open it up, and it is the book of the law. It's our sin. God's instruction to us, and we've lost it. And they take it to the king, and he's all excited. And he says, "Well, let's follow what it says in this book." But how could a nation like Israel lose God's word? It says the Passover hadn't been kept properly for hundreds and hundreds of years, right back before King David's time. That's not the image we have of them, but we can see just how slow they were to listen and really listen to God. 20 or so years later, the Jews also went into captivity. They didn't learn the lesson. They were taken into Babylon. Again, disaster. Again, if you get your mind around the pain, the suffering, the anguish, the awful time facing the people. Reality set in. Reality carted off to a foreign country. And the Babylonians believed they were awfully nice people towards their enemies. Disaster. Well, whose fault was that? Well, Jeremiah, the prophet, was a fantastic writer. Find it over in Jeremiah chapter 7, if you have your Bible there. And he explains it very clearly. Was it God's fault, or whose fault was it? Verse 13, Jeremiah writes and he says, And now listen, because you have done all these works, says the Lord, and I speak unto you. God says, I spoke unto you, rising up early in the morning, but you heard not. You didn't listen. And I called you, but you answered me not. Verse 25. And since the day that your fathers came forth out of Egypt, it just wasn't a week or two or a month or a year, right back to the history of Israel when they come out of Egypt. I have even sent unto you all my servants, the prophets. They rose up daily, rising early in the morning so they could get your ears and your attention. But you didn't listen. Yet, verse 26 says, You hearkened not unto me, you inclined not your ear. But you hardened your neck and you hardened your heart, and you did even worse than your fathers had done. Therefore you shall speak all these words unto him, Jeremiah. But again, sadly, they will not hearken to you. You shall call unto them and warn them, but they will not listen and answer you. A very sad situation. And if we could think again, if we're going to get anything out of this sermon, if we just think during the week, the difference it would have been if they had listened. State of slavery and captivity, the blessings those people could have enjoyed is mind-boggling, is wonderful. They threw it all away. Threw it all away. You know, was it any difference, you could say, in Jesus' day? Not really. Even Jesus himself said, I have spoken to you, but you are dull of hearing. They didn't listen to him either. And again, we know the problem. But I was thinking about this last night, and the amazing thing about all of that is, and it's easy for to stand up here, and it's easy for us to point the finger back at those people. If we'd have been there, probably we might have much different today. But the wonderful thing, God's grace, we preach it, talk about it, we have a church called our Grace Communion. But God's mercy and God's grace, God says there's going to be a change of heart. There's going to become a time, he says, when my people, who I love, and God loved those people. He says, people whom I love, he says, will listen. I will put a new law, a new mind, I will put a new law in their hearts. I will give them a different attitude. And they will be my people. And I will be their God. I will forgive them. And that shows a great extent of God's mercy, God's grace, and Jesus Christ, and what he's doing for us now. We're saved by his grace. He's going to save his people, it says, in the future. Very same place. Romans chapter 11. Think about that. Romans chapter 12 is a wonderful chapter. As someone said one time that you were on a desert island and you could only tear one page out of the Bible, you could go for the rest of your life on the one page out of Romans chapter 12. And I say, well, I would love to add chapter 11. Beautiful chapter. And it will move you. Read it sometime and see how the Apostle Paul had so much love for his countrymen. He said, I would even give up my salvation if I could for my brothers. Whew. Man, that is what you call it, listening to God. That is my loving your neighbour. One thing for certain, even though the people didn't listen to Jesus, Jesus was a fantastic public speaker. I would say the best ever in the history of mankind. He had that ability to reach the audience here. He could reach your mind, reach your heart, reach you. There is a verse, as it says, the Roman centurion was listening to Christ. And remember when Rome spoke, and they had the best orators. They had the trained men. They had the people who knew how to put words together. And when Rome spoke, the world heard. And this centurion would have heard those. And yet when he heard the words of Christ, he said, there's no man speaks like this man. So Christ was a fantastic orator. But he was also a wonderful listener. A brilliant, marvelous listener. Christ, you see, listened not just with his ears, but with his eyes. He listened with his heart and his mind. Jesus said, over in John chapter 11, let me quickly read that. It's a beautiful scripture. John chapter 11. Verse 41, I think it is. Yeah. And he's talking, and he says, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. It was important that God, of course, heard Christ. Jesus says, and I knew that you have heard me always. Bring it. No doubt. But because of the people, Jesus says, which are standing around me, I say it, that they may believe that you have sent me. There's a verse, Psalm 116, Alex was telling me this morning on the phone, and it says that, because, Father, you have heard me, I will praise you, and I will talk to you. Psalm 116, verse 1 and 2. But let's just see a wee example here of Jesus, how he heard. Matthew chapter 20. It's a well-known story, and probably that is the problem, if there's going to be a problem with it. Matthew 20, verse 29. The problem is that because we read these stories so often, we can become, you've heard it so many times, and you can lose a lot because of that. Familiarity can breed all sorts of things. Verse 29. It's a story where Jesus Christ is coming along, and it says he was followed by a great multitude. But just imagine a big crowd, maybe hundreds of people, all vying to get his attention, all trying to get close to him. Oh, what did he say? What did he say? Why is he doing it? Look. All trying to get close, all right. And Jesus is going along, and the disciples with him. And it says here there was 2 blind men sitting on the side of the road. They're probably there every day because they didn't travel too far. And they're crying out, help us, have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David. Have mercy on us. So the people there said, shh, keep quiet. If you can't see your hearts, keep quiet. Wash yourself now. Here's the man crying out. But what did the people, the multitude, hear? What they heard was probably embarrassment. These 2 guys are always crying out to those. That's what they heard. That's what they heard was a sort of a nuisance factor, perhaps. Keep quiet, be quiet. You sit there, keep quiet. Jesus is coming. But what did Jesus hear? In spite of all the noise, the people, the multitudes and all, what did Jesus hear? He heard the voices. He heard the pain in those voices. He heard the anguish, and he heard the awful despair. He heard a cry. He heard a grasping at straws. This was our last straw. This was it, the final straw. And Jesus was able to hear it. And it says he stopped. He stopped. And he indicated for them, bring them people here. Of course, it tells you. And he says, what do you want me to do? And Jesus had said, have compassion on them. And he touched their eyes. And immediately their eyes received sight. And they followed him. What a listener. What a lesson for us. Just don't hear words that people speak to you. Hear what they're saying. Hear what they're really saying. And let's face it, most of us don't really say what's in our heart. You don't really do it. How you doing, Ross? Well, I'm fine, thank you. When my heart's breaking inside, when I'm depressed and I'm down. You don't say it, do you? Maybe in a one-to-one, but we don't really tell, but you can pick it up if you really listen. As Christians, I'd say we should be endeavouring to be better listeners, hearing that cry for help. Not only hearing what people say, but hearing what people don't say. Because most times they don't really say what they need to say. There's a Chinese writer, Lao Tzu. He said, listening is a source of great strength. And that's so true, it is. I would add, it's also a source of great encouragement. So not only is it important to listen to God, but to listen to other people. My friend John Duffy, we all know John well. He was visiting for a few days a couple of weeks ago, and of course John will be waxing eloquent about some subject, and of course instead of listening, I made the mistake of interrupting, and I put in my tuppence worth. Disaster, it was almost stupid. I could have kicked myself for days after it. instead of listening to what the guy had to say. And what he had to say, I thought about it later, he was right anyway, so. But of course I went wanting to get my wee bit in, and then he said, oh, you haven't got a right voice. So. But I could have kicked myself. He sends his regards, by the way, too. I was ringing him yesterday on the telephone, and he sends his love. I could give other examples, I'm sure you all could too, where you don't listen. You didn't really listen. And you end up in trouble. Soapy bubble, as I call it. Big trouble. Just because you didn't really listen. I've seen in situations where I've had to pray for days. Days. Because I find myself in a situation because I didn't listen. Didn't heed. I find myself in a situation where I pray, God, please, can you please get me out of this situation? Dig me out of this, please. And he's probably saying, well, Ross, if you had only listened in the first place, you wouldn't have been there. Someone said one time, if speaking rather is silver, then listening is gold. And that's very true. There are many, many times I can think of examples in my life when I wished I had listened more carefully. I'll give a quick example. Years ago, my father, he was living at home and I was at work, and Mum had moved to another house, and Daddy used to bring his meals up for him to look after him. But she had her family to look after, so she had to go back home again. But anyway, Dad loved the fire, the open fire, he loved the coal fire. Get him in front of a big fire and he was as happy as Ori, that's all he needed. I used to fill the coal bucket in the morning for him and set it beside the horse, and he just had to shovel it off. And he loved to poke the fire. I think we all do. Look, poke the fire. But one evening I came home and we were sitting at the fire talking, and he said, Ross, I dropped the poker. I said, I dropped the poker. And I immediately looked down at the hearth to see if the poker had cracked the hearth. Well, I think the hearth's all right, okay. But I really wasn't listening. About a week or so later, my niece had gone to the shop for my dad to get him his 20 Park Drive and his bottle of cough mixture. This woman in the shop said that's the contradiction of the year, 20 Park Drive and a bottle of cough mixture. But when she came back, Dad was lying on the hall floor. He had had a stroke. You see, if I had listened, that's why he dropped the poker. Minor stroke. But I missed it. We had to take him to the hospital, wish him an ambulance, and he was paralysed down one side of his face. He recovered after a few, I suppose, a year or so, but he took more strokes, and eventually he died. But as I say, it's easy to not really hear what people are saying to you. Dad wasn't a very good communicator, really, but by saying he dropped the poker, he was saying Ross, but I didn't pick it up. Of course, there are many examples, we can think of many, of people who are really good listeners. So many out there. People trained to it. I can think of Mother Teresa. I've read her book. I had the flu one time and I was reading her life story. 1 minute I was sitting up the bed and the bedroom was going around because I had this light, but I was still reading. And 1 minute I was virtually cheering with the joy. And then the next page I was crying. What a book. What a life. And Mother Teresa, there's a book about her called The Silent Path. The Silent Path. And in that you'll read where Mother Teresa spent a lot of time talking to God. That's what kept her going, she said. Talking to God. But she makes a point. But I take time also to listen. Listen. Listen for God. See, so many times I get my answer from God. She also had the ability to kneel down there in the gutter And it's not like our gutters in Calcutta, believe me. Raw sewage runs down the gutters in Calcutta. And she was able to kneel there on the street, hug those people with sores, and listen to them as they breathed their last wish. She had that ability to listen to those people, because that was the most important thing to them. People couldn't do anything medically for them. And Mother Teresa's, she had some sisters who helped her, and they didn't get anything out of it. They didn't get anything at all. All they had was their garment, a change of garment, and a bucket, a little plastic bucket. That's all they had, that's all they owned. I remember hearing a story where one of the sisters was kneeling down and caring for a dear soul, and the lady took off an elastic band. She had found an elastic band in the street, and she wore it like a bracelet. That was all she owned. And she took off the elastic band and she handed it to the sister. She says, "I'd like you to have my bracelet." And the sister said, "Thank you very much." But she didn't keep it. She, in turn, then gave it to someone else. Those people were brilliant carers, but brilliant listeners. We can learn so much from them. Years ago, saying to Alex there, I had been counselled for depression. A lot of us go through depression from time to time. There are 20 million people, would you believe, in America? As we sit here, 20 million people who are depressed. So it's a big thing, a big problem. Sometimes we suffer from it. But I had some counselling for my depression. A lovely lady, and she said that she would ask me questions, and I would just speak, encourage me to talk. But I was amazed. I was totally amazed. Because after maybe 15, 20 minutes, she would communicate. She would say, "Well, Morris, as you said," how did you remember that? She can remember everything I said. Her ear was so finely tuned. Wonderful. And then she could help. She'd say, "You made that point, Morris. You said such and such. I'll say to you." But she was trained to be a really effective listener. Ralph Nichols, who was a famous writer, he said one time, the best way to understand people is to listen to them. Now, most of us have taken a flight from another of us in our lives. Maybe more than one. But have you ever thought, plane in the air, a plane taking off, plane in the air, and plane about to land? Communication from the pilot to the ground tower. Flight 111 approaching Irwin. Tower, flight 111 on course. Reduce speed, turn right. Have you ever considered what would happen if the people in the tower weren't really listening? Or if the pilot wasn't really listening to the instruction? Now you would say, that doesn't happen. But it does. And sometimes everybody is killed on the plane. Because there was a breakdown in communication. Someone didn't listen. I've improved it greatly, I believe. So in case any of you are heading, don't worry too much about it, but it does show you again what we can take for granted. Just assume you fly, but there's that communication which is so vital to the lives of everybody on board. It really does, as I say, pay to listen with our heart, with our eyes, with our ears, and with our minds. It's also good, I would consider, to also listen to your own advice. Listen to your own advice. We're all good at giving advice, and that's good. We have to. It's good advice. But lots of times we give advice to someone and they end up, we don't even heed that same advice ourselves. And we end up in all sorts of problems. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I don't think I need to turn it to it, but the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he says the very same thing. He says, I have to be careful what I say, in case I don't heed what I'm telling you, and I do the same thing myself, and I fall victim. And he says, in case I become a castaway, that's the way he worded it. In case I become a castaway. The word for castaway apparently means to be drowned in the sea or in a reservoir. That's how it was important, he said, that he listened to the advice that he gave to other people. I know I could go on and on, lots of stuff, lots of notes, but I know we've all gotten the point. You can almost hear the tea boiling anyway, so maybe we could just bring it to a close this morning. Just give you another short story I came across recently about effective listening. There was a group of ladies in Africa, and they were sitting around in a circle, and they were from all countries around the world, all the social workers and things like that there. And they were sitting around, and each one was going to be telling about their own lives. Okay. There was a young black African woman, and she was sitting there in that circle. Each one, as I say, had a chance to tell a story from her life. When her turn came, she began to quietly tell of a true story, of true horror, of how she had found her grandparents slaughtered in their village. The rest of the women, they reacted, and they all got up and they came towards her. In the presence of such horror, in the presence of such pain, they felt it. And they instinctively wanted to do something for this girl. They wanted to fix it, to make it better for her. Anything to remove the pain of the tragedy from this young girl's life. Now, it says that the young girl felt their compassion for her, but also felt them smothering her in a sense and closing in on her. She put her hands up, as if to push back their desires to help. And she said, I don't need you to fix me. I just need you to listen to me. Isn't that so true? Sometimes that's what it's about. Just listening, really listening to someone. I suppose you should say thank you very much for listening, bearing with me this morning. But let's continue, brethren. I know we are good listeners. Speaking to the converted this morning as always, but I think maybe we could all aim to improve it a little bit and to be even better listeners. I just wonder, come to me this morning, I just wonder with this subject, that just maybe God is going to be saying something to us this week. sure that we're really listening. As it says, be a good listener. Your ears will never get you into trouble.